Everybody, welcome back to Fight Chat Friday. So today's episode is a little bit different. We're already is as I look at the date here on the laptop, it's already July 9th.
Oh, yeah.
So we're already past midway of 2021. So we thought it might be a good opportunity to have a bit of a rewind and take 10 valuable takeaways that we've seen over the last couple of months in our Fight Chat Friday and other episodes as well. So some from some friends as well will
Yeah,
join
absolutely.
in today. So today's is basically just a bit of a big lesson and takeaway of the start of 2021. So it's just a bit of a recap and some reminders that are very, very valuable and good takeaways to have in your sparring game.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of important at this stage to say, like, these are things that we say jumped out to us or stood out to us, but also ones that, people have had a chat with us after watching an episode and have said, look, actually, really hadn't thought about that before, but when you say it that way, or when whoever it was that the guest was or the example was puts it that way, okay, yeah, now I see why that's important. And there was certainly a few of those on occasion in some of the shows that really jumped out to us. So shall we kick off? I think, yeah, these aren't in any particular order, but like we'll number them
No.
1 to 10. So we'll go with number one first. And the very first one we had goes back to the episode where we had Neil Ernest on. And it was the idea of the first in, last out. And I think you need to kind of clarify what we mean by that one.
Yeah, for sure. Because like last out, maybe it implies that maybe you're the last out in terms of the last one to stay in the contact, but essentially you want to be the last one to score or make contact. So
Yeah.
I know that might sound the same, but there's an intricate detail there really, because you don't want to be the one that stays in there and is the last one to go, and maybe they get the opportunity to exit out of the contact first.
Yeah,
So you
on
see,
their
Neil is
terms.
great here. Exactly. Neil is great at this. Sometimes he chooses one or two shots, but he's always like the first one out of contact if he can, and the last one to try get a score.
Yeah.
So even though you might be not the first one out, you still want to be the person who is the last one to score, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think when you think of it in that way, what he's really looking at is, can you make the first contact and initiate the contact? So that gives you the initial impression on the referees. I started this. I was the positive actor.
Mm.
I made the first impression, and then can you make a good last impression as well? So whether that's
Yeah.
exiting on your terms, or exiting with a score, or finishing with that big score. And Neil did that very, very well. So I think, make good first and last impression by getting a point on the way in and on the way out. That's a really, really good way to have it.
Like it's important as well that you don't want to be the last one there when you don't need to be there. So you want to get out there at a good opportunity where you can get a shot off where they can't.
So then we kind of jumped into, a kind of a skill acquisition one. And we were talking about the idea of going one step further. And this came from one of our chats in the live sessions that we were doing earlier in the year. And the kind of question was asked of, should you always try to add punches onto the end of your kicking routines or techniques? And we kind of took it a different way. And we were saying, well, adding something beyond the skill that you're actually working on kind of makes you focus on really finishing out that skill properly, with proper balance, with a good recovery, and with an eye to the next possibility. And here we've got Hong absolutely mixing it and throwing from everywhere. And I think he kind of
And
epitomizes that philosophy.
definitely, and he's always engaged. But you see, like people who like drill and they use like combinations, you can see that sometimes they'll do a combination and then they just switch off. Where
Yeah.
you see in reality, there's no opportunity to switch off, and Hong he shows that you have to keep going, and it's very much linked to the first one as well.
Mm.
But it's like you saying in terms of the development of the skill, if you can always be thinking one step further, it will actually improve the original shot or maybe the entry shot, because that has to be better for you to set your balance, for you to think about the next thing that's coming down the line.
Yeah, and I think just psychologically, in terms of what you're doing, it shifts where the end is. So if you were going to run 100 meters, there's a psychological bit of like, you've got to finish that 100 meters strong. You don't ease off towards the end, even if you're
Yeah.
Usain Bolt, right? So you don't ease off towards the end. You have to run through the line, and that's why they have a crash mat sometimes at the end. But sometimes when we're training, we start to mentally see the end and we mentally relax there. So having that little bit of an extra add-on to the end of a particular drill or routine, or even in terms of your constrained spars, that the same kind of philosophy applies, where if you get to the edge of the ring, it can so often be a thing of, oh, we put up our hand and we walk our way back in the class. But maybe there's that little bit extra where there has to be an acknowledgement that you're in the corner and you actually have to do something about it so as not to develop those bad habits.
Mm-hmm. So it's just always thinking about what comes next.
Exactly. And then this came from two of our interviews, and these were with Thomas Barada and Adam Shelley.
Yeah, both guys who are multiple world champions as well. So both of them spoke highly about the whole idea of bringing an intensity and a specific tempo to the fight on their terms. So it was like based on the control they had of the match, but when they decided to go, they went to work. And then they got a lot of points on the board if possible. And it's just bringing that intensity and that control that they have over the bout.
Exactly. And I mean, it isn't all about, being on the front foot 100% of the time, all the time. Mm-hmm. But it is deciding that, you want your opponent to be uncomfortable and working at your tempo, your pace, and your intensity all of the time. So choosing that, when to be faster, when to be slower, when to ramp up the pressure, and really maintaining that makes it a tougher experience for your opponent, and one where a skill differential doesn't necessarily count for as much if the skill differential is in your opponent's favour, where you can choose when and how hard the engagements are. And I think both of those guys, Master Barada and Adam Shelley, do a great job of deciding, how the match is built, how it happens, and they don't really allow their opponents to capitalize on their strengths, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's definitely a mindset. Both of those guys, they want to control, and they want to. They're almost ruthless when they're in there. They're not giving their opponent any leeway, and it's that mindset, I think, that is what brought both of those particular people to really high levels.
And especially if you look at the kind of later years of both their careers, and it's not like Adam's career was phenomenally long in Taekwondo, but can you really picture a time where you ever looked at either of them and said, oh, they look tired now, go for it? And
yeah,
I certainly can't. And so knowing that's a tough thing to take on as an opponent, isn't it, that you can't use that particular avenue, you can't tire them out, you can't wait until they lose their sharpness or whatever, that they're still coming. So yeah, I think that was that's another factor of it. So this next one is one you picked out, Richie, and it kind of came up in when we were looking at in particular one match with Bartosz, but
Mm-hmm. Yeah, usually the traditional way of punching is let's keep the elbows a little tighter, and that's the way we see it in boxing. But we see here, for our particular sport, it's actually not the most efficient way to get visible, clear scores on the board. So this is a sport where it's not about power, like boxing, for example. It's about getting clear scores on the board. And that's very, very important for us because it's the direct line of attack. So usually, like boxers, they have the elbows tucked in because they got to worry about hooks to the body and things like that. But for our sports, it's a little bit different. So the traditional way of boxing, we can definitely use a lot from it. But I think that the direct route of A to B shows that the elbows aren't the same as boxing, even though that's how people might teach people at the beginning, and it's how their classes may be structured for beginners, of teaching them the correct way to punch. But for the sport side and our particular sport, maybe that's not the best route.
Yeah, and again, it comes back, I suppose, to the underlying principles behind both sports. And in the end, our priorities are, number one, if we do get a score, we want it to be a clear score so that we get the reward from the judges. And I mean, that was something that we certainly discussed in one of our episodes. And the second thing that we have then is, within boxing, you would be looking to penetrate the guard to get your glove on the target and to have it take effect. So it has to land in a way that it's going to have some effect. The thing that we will often do is we'll come slightly over the top of the guard or around the guard, and we're hitting towards the forehead and the top of the head here, where the effect is very minimal a lot of the time, but damage, it's very hard to actually have your hands high enough to protect against that. Because I mean, if you're in boxing, you would be looking more at tucking the chin, rolling the head to deflect those shots. You're not going to try to bring your hands up to block them or engage with them that way. So we're kind of taking advantage of the fact that you're really not going to be blocking those. We're going to try to get the person at the top of the head where it's clear for the judges to see, and we're creating that little bit of movement where if you can lift the forehead, you're starting the person on that backward, you're taking their head behind their center of gravity, and we're starting that momentum journey, where what we really might like at the end of that is we take our ring position, we build our score, get that kick to the body or head on as a finisher, and that's kind of what we're looking at. So a touch with some momentum, as opposed to a rattling shot that's going to, make you feel hit. I suppose it brings in a bit of difference.
And that's why it's very important, if anybody's seen last week's episode with Master Howard, of how he used the analogy of different types of music for the different facets of Taekwondo. And it just shows the difference between the self-defense side and the sport side of sparring or Taekwondo, whatever way you want to put it.
So the next one is, we're actually going to show a clip. It was from our top 10 sparring skills, and it was an interesting kind of journey for both of us, because we went independently on it. So Richie went away, locked himself up there in Cork, and did his bit of thinking about it and arrived at 10 sparring skills, and I did the same here in Clare, and we kind of came up with our own skills. And of course we had some overlap, but we had some points of difference, and one of the interesting points of difference was this one. It was about resilience. So we'll just hear what we said at the time. And what I'm really talking about there on the physical side, if it's very easy, is how prone to injury are you? Because if you look at a career, if you're spending chunks of particular seasons on that prehab, rehab, injured, rehab, re-injured, like if you're on that train, it's really, really difficult to develop the consistent improvement over time that you really, really want. And it adds up. It's a really cumulative thing. And of course, it's digging away at your mindset. You're not like taking your little wins and building on them. You're taking your setbacks and trying to you're basically being defensive in your mindset, rather than building a more positive, aggressive mindset.
First thing that pops to mind there is two Irish guys lacking a bit of vitamin D in the winter.
Absolutely, and maybe just not understanding our lighting as well, or whatever it happens to be. But no, for anyone who isn't from here, there is no such thing as vitamin D in Ireland for at least 6 months of the year. You can squeeze in a bit for the rest of it, but yeah, there's not much. And I mean, you can certainly debate whether or not resilience is a skill. So I was looking at it two ways, because we had physical resilience, which I'm talking about there, and resistance to injury, versus resilience mentally, and in terms of mental fortitude and and staying power and different things. But the concept was that so much of high performance in sport is around how well you spend your time, and everyone is given the same amount of hours in the day and days in the week and so on, and it's how much more effectively you can use that, and you can emphasize your talents and strengths and skills versus your opponents. And if you're spending some of that time, or a lot of that time in particular, rehabbing and rebuilding after injuries, it's pretty tough. So the skill can be training in the right way, and applying your training in the right way to avoid injury. It can be selecting techniques and modes of training that suit you, but at the same time it's also in some ways just a physical attribute of like, how are you built and how are you made up, but something that we felt was really important.
Yeah, for me it was a very important point, because for me personally, I would see strength training about the physical attributes, develop your power, your speed, all of that stuff. And then when you hit it from that point of view, it kind of struck a chord. I was like, that makes so much sense, because from the 20 plus years that I've seen in Taekwondo, it's always the people who stay end up being successful at the end.
Of course, yeah.
But you as it says, you got to be in it to win it, and that's just so important. And somebody who kind of springs to mind there, who has some problems with injuries, was Lindsay Conway, a 3-time world champion. So Absolutely. Somebody who's been in and out, but has come back really, really strong each time. So who knows how many more titles she would have been able to win in Europe, if she was able to compete, but just happened to be plagued with injury. So it's just an important thing, and it is a massive factor. But sometimes it's out of your control, of course.
Yeah, but again, like, while still sticking on the theme of resilience, like, it's the mental resilience that was there. Physically, okay, the knees caused trouble, but mentally the resilience was there to overcome that, get back in there, build up properly, and become successful again. And you absolutely can't argue with 3 world titles. It's incredible.
Definitely.
So speaking of not sticking around, this is getting yourself out of the engagements and doing it on your terms.
Yeah, so this one is an important one. Again, came from one of our live sessions, one of the live training sessions we did during the lockdown here in Ireland, and it was just basically exiting the combat zone, I suppose, where you're getting into hands, and then having an exit strategy with that, so you can exit it. So basically, you don't want to just go to hands and have a big trade off, and then you don't have an exit strategy or a way to get out. And Katya here is phenomenal at it. She was able to go to hands and have things like the back kick, being in that really close zone. And here's one from Thomas, something a bit different. He was able to just exit out without getting hit, and that's just so important as well. So being aware of getting out of that, we say that combat zone, that hand-to-hand combat zone, is very, very important.
Absolutely. And, there are multiple strategies that work. I mean, again, fundamentally, our game is the game of like hit and don't get hit.
Mm-hmm.
So what we are looking about is, in the same way as with Neil, is like have that last say or have that last shot, make that last good impression. In this case, we're talking about having an exit strategy. So you're not going into a contact without a plan for how you get yourself back out. And like every plan, the plan has to adapt to the situation as it evolves. But we often find people that they start punching and they don't stop punching until the match stops or it's stopped for them or someone travels. Whereas at a point along the way, maybe they could have, added the kick, come back, re-engaged. So having a plan around that is really, really important, and it's not necessarily something that people build into all of their. It's often in drills, but it's not often in the condition spars. So that's one of the things that we could certainly think about including a little bit more in terms of our condition spars.
Very important one. Like, it's like in military, there's no unit going to go into any combat zone without an evacuation plan, and it's very, very similar.
Yeah, it absolutely is. So then we have something that we borrowed. So it happened to be that this was lining up. We were chatting with John Mackey very shortly after, and we had a schedule very shortly after Jamie with the Black Belter podcast. Was chatting with John Mackey, and something came up in the Black Belter podcast. So we thought we'd just steal it as it came in its original form.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on? I know you ask some questions around resistance bands and the use of resistance bands.
Yeah, we're going down rant avenue now, Jamie. Resistance bands are great if they're used the right way. Problem is, and a lot of the times they're not used the right way. So, resistance band 101. When you've got an elastic band or resistance band here, there's absolutely no resistance until I start stretching. And the more I stretch it, the resistance increases. So resistance bands, for example, have absolutely no impact on the rate of force production for limbs. So they don't do anything on their own to increase the acceleration from point A to point B. Why? Because for example, I've got my leg attached to a resistance band. The resistance at the start is low, but it only increases when I extend the leg out. So when I make contact in and around, that's when the band starts to increase. It does nothing for the initial part of that movement. Absolutely diddly squat. And it's the initial part of the movement is where I need to have massive force production rates, because that's the bit that when I push into the ground, boom, it comes off the ground and then travels towards the target. So having them dangling on your legs and then just kicking because there's a bit of resistance on the end, there's nothing. There's nothing of any benefit really. Tying them.
So yeah, that really jumped out. It was at the time because we were listening to his podcast just before we had John come on. It was something we had to chat about because, again, it's the kind of thing where bands and Viper cords and all the rest of it are such a popular accessory. But are people really using them in a way that makes sense? Are they picking a resistance that actually helps in the rate of force development? Are they, and are there other ways they might be using them? And it was just one of those kind of big ideas that was easy to jump onto.
And it's more about just the bands. I titled this one "Know the Why," and that's the bigger picture here. You got to know why you're doing everything in your training. So just because you see something, and we're always talking about this, just because you see something on Instagram, don't just copy it. There's no such thing as the cookie cutter approach here. You got to understand the why, and you got to educate yourself on the reason and the context behind everything that you do, and where you're trying to get to.
Absolutely. And again, like you said, if you have a reason to use the bands and they make sense for you, fantastic, and you should. it's a case of, if you think just adding a band to a movement will make the movement somehow more explosive, more powerful, etc., you might need to rethink it to some small degree. Moving on to our number 8, we have balance over everything. And balance is one of the fundamental kind of movement skills, or one of the fundamentals of movement. It makes sense that it kind of comes before agility, it comes before coordination, so why not? Balance before everything.
Yeah, so important for us, because this came from our footwork episode that we did back in January, of how to improve and develop your footwork and how it's used. But you see here, Thomas in blue, he's phenomenal in terms of having his feet set under him all the time, and it allows him to dictate the tempo, the distance, and he because of it, he gets very good scores, and he's able to exit out just like we see here, because his feet are always under him. And we're going to see in this clip here that his opponent, he almost chases him at one point, and his feet aren't under him. You see here, he's chasing and he's forcing it. So that's why it's over everything. So you got to have balance first before you go after everything else. And there you see it there. He's kind of like lost for a second because he didn't have his feet under him.
Exactly. And I mean, what we're really talking about there, as you said, it's that underlying fundamentals. And, you know, sometimes when people think about what we're often talking about in terms of skill development and the constraints and the rest of it is, but first you have to learn the basics or the whatever. And it's kind of like, it's true, but it's not true. It's like you still need to learn the basics in context. So, you know, balance in general, and ideally you learn that when you're, 5 through 12 years of age or whatever it happens to be, and you're learning it as a kid as you grow, and you've got good fundamentals of movement, good fundamental movement skills, good fundamental game skills, and we keep transitioning this until we actually have good fundamental sport specific skills. But they're not sport specific skills until we're actually doing it in a game like situation. So having really nice footwork when you're going in and out and over hurdles and between cones and all the rest of it is grand, until you're actually under pressure and there's a kick coming at you and you have to land a blitz or something like that. So yeah, the balance allows for good footwork. It allows for fast and explosive kicking. It allows for agile movement. So it was just one that was worth jumping out on. Balance before everything.
Definitely.
So a little quote there, but improvise, adapt, and overcome. And you had 2 ideas behind this one, or 2 concepts really.
Yeah, so the first one for me is being able to do it in the ring in a 2-minute bout for 2 rounds. So if you can't, such a short time, we speak about it all the time, if you can adjust and adapt based on the scoreboard and what's happening, you might have a go-to shot, but maybe it's not working for whatever reason. You need to adapt, and you need to recognize that quickly, because if you don't, the time is up. The scoreboard might be something that you're chasing for the rest of the bout, and it's not always something that you can go and catch. And then there's the other one, Adrian, as well, that we have. Maybe you can have a chat about that based on some of the fighters we have in these clips.
Yeah, and I mean, I was looking at, and I pulled in Hong Lui and Maciek Suk, and these are guys who've had long careers in Taekwondo, and they've been in and around the quarterfinals and semi-finals again and again and again at major championships. And what that does over time is, well, you're not entering the same game. It's fundamentally the same concept, but the skills required, the opponents you have to overcome, all of that changes over time. And by having that ability to recognize that changing environment, to adapt to that, and to improvise, in the moment, to find a solution that's going to work for them with their skill set, that's a product of longevity in the sport. And it also facilitates longevity on the sport. If you can't adapt and improvise, you won't overcome and you won't reach the heights. And we can see where, Hong at 40 winning a European Championships, and Maciek won the European Championships not so very long ago in Slovenia. And I mean, I don't know what age the guy is. He must be close, about 30 odd. But I would say he's had 10 years not winning that European Championships, at least, we'll say. So, he's had to adapt quite a few times to arrive to that position where he can stand on top of the podium. So, well done to those guys, and inspired a topic.
Definitely, because you can see that we did a very actual, it was a popular video that we did on Fight Chat Friday, the evolution of styles in ITF, and you can see it's almost like a wheel in terms of the way they come around and they cycle back around again. So to be able to take bits and pieces from each one and adapt, improvise, and come up with your own style, I think that's a very, very important lesson.
Definitely. And then one that was very close to both our hearts was deliberate practice. And we've chosen the axe kick for this one, but it really does apply to any skill that you might want to work on. The concept of it's not going to accidentally just get better. It needs to have a particular focus in your training before it's going to improve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important, because people speak about, the axe kick, you just do it on the pads, but you need to be able to do it in context, and that's the key. So just like a quick example for people, for me, I'm at the opposite end of a martial arts journey in a different martial art. So I train jiu-jitsu and I'm a white belt. So for me, it's newbie gains, learning lots. But what I do is every time I go roll, which is the equivalent to sparring, I have a little notes app on my phone, and every time there's something specific that I want to work on. So then after each session as well, I also write down 2 things that went well and something that I want to get better on for the next session. And then whether I talk to my coach or whether I look up some videos on YouTube and try to understand what I want to do better the next time, then that's my plan of attack, essentially, the deliberate practice that I have for the next rolling session. And that's why I love the live stuff a little bit more, because it gives you that instant feedback. Okay, it works or it doesn't work, but it's not going to be 100% where everything works all the time, or it shouldn't be the other way either, where it never works. So you need to find that kind of sweet spot of it will work sometimes and sometimes it will not. And then you, as we said in the previous one, you got to adapt and improvise.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's that deliberate and purposeful practice. So it's not just arriving there and seeing what happens. I mean, that's something that can work both ways between a coach and an athlete. So the athlete can arrive with their, flexible goal around, well, the session today is this, so that means I can work on this particular element. But the coaches can also look at it and say, well, hang on a second, this would be effective if we were using it, like with the axe kick, where, as we've said many times in our chats, for the people who have it, they score it often. And then for the others, they just don't throw it at all. So is it that it works because most people don't expect it and they don't see it very often, so they don't train against it very often, particularly in a live context? Or is it that there's this mysterious confidence part that some people have that allows them to throw that shot? Or do they actually just practice it and use it until it feels like it should work and it's comfortable? So it's definitely one of those things where if you make your practice more purposeful and you deliberately target, the goals that you want to achieve, you will experience more success.
Absolutely.
So that's our top 10 list for the first half of 2021. So hopefully we'll have, a few new things to add to the top 10 for the overall for 2021.
Of course, I'm sure we will. And maybe if you've picked up anything as well, some people watch Fight Chat Friday every week, or they're regular listeners / watchers, and maybe there's something that you've taken away over watching a few episodes that is a real highlight for you, because everything is kind of specific to your journey right now. Something that you've seen in this video might be relevant to where you are right now in your training or whatever, and it will stand out to you. So maybe you can share something in the comments that you've taken away from any episode, and it might help some other people who can see that in the comments as well. So if you've taken anything from our episodes thus far, not just 2021, throw it in the comments, share some takeaway that you've had, and I'm sure that'll be really cool for people to see.
Very good. So until next Friday, everybody, best of luck.